roommate was attacked. I know it. I heard it. She's screaming. She was thrown to the ground.
Do me a favor, calm down. Calm down. Other than your roommate, is there anybody else inside the house?
I don't know.
There was no sign of a struggle at the door. No broken lock. No forced entry. Whoever came inside did not need permission. They already had access. They already knew the space. That detail matters. Because crimes like this do not begin on the night they happen. They begin earlier. With patterns. With choices. With warning signs that are easy to dismiss until they are not. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual. A quiet residence. A normal evening. No immediate reason for concern. But normality can be deceptive. Especially when danger wears familiarity. Especially when the threat is someone who has been close before. This was not a sudden act. It was not random. It followed a trajectory. One shaped by obsession. By entitlement. By an inability to accept an ending. The unsettling part is not how violent it became. It is how predictable the path was. Because the behavior involved here was not hidden. It was documented. Recognized. Even addressed at one point. And yet, none of that stopped what followed. The woman at the center of this case understood these risks. Not instinctively. Professionally. She knew how control develops quietly. How persistence turns into surveillance. How leaving a relationship does not always end the danger. That knowledge should have offered protection. At least, that is what most people would assume. But this case challenges that assumption. It raises questions about boundaries. About systems. About how much safety actually exists once obsession takes hold. Before names are introduced. Before timelines are explained. Before the outcome is revealed. There is one question that refuses to settle. How did a threat that was already recognized still manage to reach her? Before the headlines. Before the court records. Before the night everything ended. She was known for her work. Not for controversy. Not for attention. But for listening. People came to her when they felt unsafe. When they were confused. When they needed someone to take their fears seriously. Her field required trust. A single misstep could ruin her reputation. A single missed warning could have serious consequences. She focused on relationships. On power. On the slow, almost invisible ways control can take root. On the damage caused when affection becomes manipulation. She spoke openly about emotional abuse. About manipulation that leaves no visible marks. About partners who isolate, intimidate, and quietly erode confidence. To many, she was clarity personified. Someone who could name what others struggled to explain. Someone who validated experiences people were told to ignore. Professionally, she was respected. Her voice reached beyond private sessions. Articles. Public discussions. Awareness campaigns. From the outside, her life appeared structured. Grounded. Purposeful. And yet, expertise alone does not make someone immune. Understanding patterns does not always allow you to outrun them. Which raises the first troubling question. If she understood control better than most, what was happening in her own life that no one else fully saw? Her professional life was a map of patterns. She could spot control where others missed it, predict escalation before it happened, and advise people on how to protect themselves. She was meticulous, methodical, disciplined in how she observed human behavior. Nothing escaped her attention. But personal life is rarely as controlled as professional life. Outside her work, relationships followed a different rhythm. Expectations collided. Boundaries were tested. And even someone trained to recognize danger could face blind spots. Friends described her as calm, rational, dependable. A person who handled crises with clarity. Someone who could diffuse tension without drama. Her family and colleagues trusted her judgment. They believed she could manage any threat. They assumed her awareness offered immunity. Yet, awareness is not armor. Expertise cannot erase vulnerability. Sometimes knowing the risks only sharpens the frustration when they come true. Her days were full of structure. Appointments, calls, articles, consultations. Every hour accounted for. Every decision deliberate. But threats don't always follow schedules. Obsession doesn't respect calendars. Danger often strikes in the spaces between routines, quietly and efficiently. And that is what makes her story hard to grasp. Because the skills that saved others could not save her. Which leads to the next question. If knowledge and vigilance could not prevent the worst, how did the danger remain unseen until it was too late? Her personal life, though private, held contradictions. A professional with control over chaos, yet a human with trust in those around her. She believed boundaries were respected when clearly stated. She assumed honesty would guide behavior. She trusted familiarity to act as protection. She valued relationships built on respect. But not everyone reciprocated that respect. Some people blurred the lines. Some people ignored warnings. Some allowed entitlement to dictate actions. Even someone trained to recognize patterns can misjudge intent. Even someone vigilant can underestimate the persistence of obsession. Even someone careful can be caught off guard by deception. Her social circles saw a woman of composure. Calm in crisis. Rational in thought. Able to parse motives without panic. Someone who could listen, analyze, and respond without bias. But trust is complicated. Especially when it intersects with personal emotions. Because expertise in human behavior does not guarantee immunity from manipulation. Because people who respect rules are often surprised by those who disregard them entirely. She lived in a space where professional acuity met personal vulnerability. Where every day required assessment. And yet, some risks existed in plain sight and were quietly ignored. Or underestimated. Or dismissed. This duality defined her life. Her vigilance could guide others. But it could not shield her entirely. Which brings a chilling question. How could someone so alert and knowledgeable about danger be blindsided in her own life by those very patterns she studied? The relationship began quietly. Ordinary encounters, familiar routines, small gestures of attention. Nothing alarming. Nothing out of place. Charm can be deceptive. At first, persistence feels like care. Interest feels like affection. Attention feels like admiration. She noticed little signs early, but they were subtle. Minor insistence. Unexpected messages. Requests that pushed boundaries, ever so slightly. Harmless, almost imperceptible. The early phase often disguises control as affection. Patterns emerge slowly. Actions are small. Threats are invisible. Obsession hides behind smiles and reassurance. People outside the relationship saw harmony. They saw someone being valued. They saw warmth and connection. They did not see the tiny erosion of autonomy, line by line. Even someone who studies control can misjudge the beginning. Because early manipulation is crafted to appear normal. Because initial charm lulls awareness. Because familiarity fosters trust. But patterns, once established, rarely disappear. The insistence that seems polite today can become coercion tomorrow. The attention that feels flattering can become surveillance. The care that appears genuine can evolve into control. And that is where this story takes its first true turn. Where trust and awareness collide. Where expertise meets unpredictability. Which raises the first unsettling question about the relationship. Why do controlling behaviors rarely look dangerous at the very start? As time passed, small behaviors began to accumulate. Requests became more frequent. Expectations grew without discussion. Boundaries were tested in subtle ways. It started with messages at odd hours. A need to know where she was. A request to respond immediately. Each instance appeared minor alone. Together, they formed a pattern she recognized from her studies. What seemed like care was beginning to resemble control. What seemed like affection was showing signs of obsession. The escalation was gradual, almost imperceptible, but persistent. People outside the relationship still saw nothing. They saw a couple interacting. They did not notice the subtle pressure, the quiet insistence, the way attention could shift into surveillance. Even someone trained to recognize manipulation can underestimate persistence. Experts understand patterns, but the human element is unpredictable. People can disguise intent, rationalize behavior, and exploit trust. She began noticing more explicit signs. Questions about her routines. Insistence on explanations for small decisions. Requests that were unreasonable, but framed as concern. Patterns she taught others to avoid were appearing in her own life. And recognition alone was not enough to stop them. Because understanding escalation does not always equate to control over it. It was at this stage that she began to confront the first uncomfortable reality. If warning signs are visible and recognized, why do some threats continue unchecked? As the relationship progressed, subtle control became more visible. Small decisions she once made freely were now questioned. Her choices were commented on, reframed, or challenged. Every deviation from expectations drew attention. Isolation began quietly. Friends and colleagues noticed less of her time. Social events were skipped. Personal activities were subtly discouraged. It was framed as care, concern, or shared preference. Manipulation often hides in the familiar. It doesn't arrive with threats or shouting. It arrives as guidance, as suggestion, as something that seems logical. And it works precisely because it appears reasonable. She recognized these patterns in herself. The tension between autonomy and accommodation grew. Her professional training made her vigilant, but human instinct still searches for compromise. Even when a situation triggers alarm, denial is easy, especially early on. Attempts to maintain boundaries were met with pressure. Requests became demands. Questions became interrogations. Concerns became accusations. Each small push created stress and subtle self-doubt. The dynamic evolved into a cycle. Attention disguised as control. Concern disguised as obligation. Persistence disguised as love. And that is where the first real warning signs became impossible to ignore. Which forces the next difficult question. How can someone trained to spot manipulation remain trapped in its earliest stages? The pattern of control continued to intensify. Requests and demands became unavoidable. Boundaries that were once respected were now questioned at every turn. Small compromises became daily routines, leaving little space for autonomy. She attempted to address concerns directly. Conversations were structured, rational, measured. Warnings were given. Limits were set. Expectations clarified. Yet the responses were calculated. Acknowledgement without change. Apologies without alteration. Insistence masked as concern. Compliance expected, but never truly granted. The escalation became psychological. Pressure replaced dialogue. Monitoring replaced trust. Attention transformed into intrusion. What was once subtle now demanded constant mental energy. Outside observers could see stress accumulating. Friends, family, and colleagues noticed her cautiousness. They saw a person who navigated carefully, measured each interaction, and adjusted behavior to prevent conflict. But even they underestimated the persistence and intensity that continued behind closed doors. This stage is critical in understanding escalation. Patterns that begin innocuously often intensify with time. Control becomes normalized. Obsession appears benign. And the target begins to question their own perception. Even someone trained to recognize warning signs can find themselves facing a paradox. Knowledge does not guarantee safety. Awareness does not always prevent violation. Preparation does not eliminate risk. Which leads to the unsettling question. When escalation is slow, calculated, and persistent, how does someone intervene before it becomes unstoppable? The early warning signs were subtle but consistent. Unexplained insistence on schedules. Unexpected messages at odd hours. Questions about activities that had once been private. Each incident seemed minor in isolation. Alone, they were easy to dismiss or rationalize. Together, they formed a pattern she recognized immediately. She documented these behaviors. She discussed them with friends, family, and colleagues. She advised others on how to respond to similar patterns. She knew which steps could prevent escalation. Yet recognition alone was not enough. Awareness cannot always stop persistence. Knowledge cannot always prevent obsession. Even preventive measures are limited when the other party refuses to accept boundaries. Attempts to reinforce limits were met with minimal compliance. Promises were made. Words were spoken. But actions rarely changed. The early alerts were warnings. Small red flags accumulating into a visible pattern. They were recorded, noticed, acknowledged, and yet, underestimated by everyone around her. Even she found herself questioning if she had done enough. This stage demonstrates a difficult truth. Danger rarely announces itself. It grows slowly, often in plain sight. The combination of persistence, subtle control, and societal underestimation creates a trap. Which brings the next pressing question. If the warning signs were visible, recognized, and documented, why did no intervention prevent what was coming? As time progressed, subtle behaviors became more pointed. Insistence turned into demands. Questions became interrogations. Attention transformed into scrutiny. The pattern was no longer easy to ignore. Each action carried weight. Each message, each request, each visit chipped away at autonomy. She began noticing signs that suggested persistence beyond reason. Attempts to explain boundaries were met with defensiveness. Attempts to assert independence were challenged. Warnings were dismissed as overreaction. The escalation was calculated. Not impulsive. Not chaotic. But deliberate. Slow enough to appear reasonable. Persistent enough to create tension and uncertainty. Even those around her noticed a shift. Concerned friends and colleagues observed that she was now cautious. Alert to small details. Measuring every interaction. Navigating each day as if the next violation was imminent. Yet the direct threats were not always visible. They often existed in tone, implication, and pressure. A call when it should not have come. A visit that seemed casual but carried scrutiny. Small actions accumulating into psychological weight. At this stage, she faced a familiar paradox. Knowledge gave her clarity. Awareness provided insight. But neither could fully stop what was escalating. Which forces the next troubling question. When persistence becomes deliberate and calculated, how can anyone truly protect themselves before it crosses the line? Recognizing the growing danger, she took steps to protect herself. Boundaries were clearly stated. Warnings were issued. Trusted friends and colleagues were informed of the patterns. Every precaution available was considered. She documented incidents meticulously. Messages, visits, and interactions were noted. Contacts in professional networks were alerted. Legal advice was sought. Every measure reflected her expertise in understanding risk. Yet even preparation has limits. Threats built on persistence, obsession, and refusal to respect boundaries cannot always be stopped by documentation alone. Even formal warnings do not guarantee compliance. Even the most rational precautions can fail when met with relentless determination. Friends and family offered support. But they were limited by their own assumptions. They believed in her knowledge. They assumed that her expertise provided protection. They underestimated the intensity of what was developing behind closed doors. She faced a paradox familiar to those in her field. The better you understand the mechanisms of control, the more painfully visible the danger becomes. Knowledge exposes vulnerability as much as it offers insight. And still, the escalation continued. Every action, every insistence, every intrusion was a reminder that awareness does not equal immunity. Which raises the next critical question. If every precaution was taken, documented, and communicated, what allowed the escalation to continue unchecked toward its inevitable conclusion? The night arrived quietly, almost ordinarily. No alarm sounded. No unusual messages. No immediate indication that the culmination of patterns was near. But the signals had been there all along. Subtle behaviors that had escalated over weeks and months converged into a single moment. Persistent demands. Intrusions disguised as concern. Manipulation cloaked as affection. Everything she had documented, everything she had warned others about, pointed to this night. Yet the sense of normalcy persisted. Because danger does not always announce itself. It arrives quietly, in the spaces where vigilance falters. She prepared. Boundaries were reiterated. Precautions were in place. Contacts were informed. Even her professional training guided each step. Still, the intensity of persistence can overwhelm even the most meticulous planning. Even awareness cannot always counteract relentless determination. Even documentation cannot replace immediate intervention. This night was not random. It was the product of a long trajectory. A series of choices, miscalculations, and ignored warning signs. A pattern that had been building incrementally, almost imperceptibly. Those outside the situation may wonder how it could happen. Those studying the patterns may recognize the escalation. But understanding does not prevent outcome. Which brings the chilling question. How does a night that seemed ordinary become the point where all prior warnings converge into irreversible danger? Once the night began, subtle control escalated quickly. Small intrusions became deliberate actions. Attention became surveillance. Insistence became pressure. Every boundary she had set was challenged. Every precaution she had taken was tested. Each moment demanded calculation, observation, and adjustment. There was no room for error. The person responsible had studied her patterns, had noted routines, had anticipated responses. Persistence had become strategy. Obsession had become method. What appeared to outsiders as ordinary interaction was anything but. Each movement, each word, each glance carried weight. Every misstep, however minor, could provoke reaction. The escalation was deliberate, calculated, and relentless. She remained aware, methodical, and vigilant. Her training allowed her to recognize cues. Her experience allowed her to anticipate escalation. Her planning allowed her to respond quickly to avoid immediate harm. But even vigilance has limits. Even expertise has boundaries. Even preparation cannot always counteract calculated persistence. The night forced a collision between knowledge and unpredictability. Between awareness and relentless determination. Between preparation and the unforeseeable. Which forces the next pressing question. If every pattern was recognized and every precaution taken, how can someone still be cornered by the very escalation they understood so well? She responded with caution and calculation. Every move was measured. Every word deliberate. Every reaction aimed at preventing escalation. Her awareness guided her. She anticipated patterns. She stayed alert to subtle cues. She attempted to control outcomes using her expertise. Yet control alone was not enough. Even deliberate action cannot always counter relentless persistence. Even insight cannot erase the intentions of someone who refuses limits. The tension intensified. Moments that would normally pass unnoticed now carried significance. Every decision, every response, every pause became a potential pivot point. Friends and colleagues who had been alerted could do little in real time. Warnings and documentation mattered, but they could not intervene instantly. Even support systems designed for protection were constrained by timing and access. The night illustrated a critical reality. Awareness can delay danger. Preparation can reduce risk. But calculated, determined escalation can overwhelm even the most vigilant. Her actions mitigated harm, but did not stop the trajectory entirely. The patterns she had studied, warned against, and prepared for now played out with precision. Which leads to the next difficult question. When persistence, planning, and awareness collide, can anyone truly remain safe in the face of deliberate obsession? The night ended quietly. The world outside saw nothing unusual. Daily routines resumed. Normalcy appeared intact. But inside, the impact was profound. Boundaries had been violated. Patterns she had studied and warned about had played out. Awareness guided her response, but could not stop the escalation completely. Friends and family noticed subtle tension. A posture that carried strain. A gaze that measured every movement. Even expertise could not fully predict human reaction in real time. Documentation proved its worth. Every warning. Every message. Every precaution noted. Context was clear. But records could not undo what had happened. Reflection became vital. Analyzing each action. Assessing what worked and what failed. Understanding why knowledge alone could not prevent intrusion. The experience was both professional and personal. Insight and emotion collided. Patterns she had studied theoretically became reality. Theory met lived experience, with all its unpredictability. Which leads to the lingering question. Even with meticulous preparation and awareness, how can someone reconcile understanding danger with experiencing it firsthand? The immediate danger had passed. But the effects lingered. Patterns left traces in memory. Every interaction was examined again. Every warning sign reconsidered. She studied what had happened. Not for blame. Not for regret. But to understand escalation in real life. To understand how patterns she taught could play out despite awareness. Lessons emerged clearly. Persistence can overcome vigilance. Obsession can outlast preparation. Documentation is critical, but not always preventive. Even professionals with insight can face danger they anticipate yet cannot fully stop. Systems designed to protect can fail. Support networks have limits. Even trusted authorities may intervene too late. Legal and social structures offer guidance, but they cannot eliminate human unpredictability. Her professional expertise now carried new depth. Theory met lived experience. Patterns were no longer abstract. They became concrete. Behavior, warning, escalation, all visible in hindsight. She shared insights carefully. With colleagues, friends, and those at risk. Experience added credibility. It also added weight. Responsibility now included prevention and awareness for others. Reflection was continuous. She reanalyzed each action. Each decision she made. Each signal she recognized. Every small choice had contributed to outcomes, positive or negative. And yet, the unsettling question remains. If preparation, awareness, documentation, and support are all in place, what more can truly protect someone when obsession refuses boundaries? The immediate danger had passed. But the effects lingered. Patterns left traces in memory. Every interaction was examined again. Every warning sign reconsidered. She studied what had happened. Not for blame. Not for regret. But to understand escalation in real life. To understand how patterns she taught could play out despite awareness. Lessons emerged clearly. Persistence can overcome vigilance. Obsession can outlast preparation. Documentation is critical, but not always preventive. Even professionals with insight can face danger they anticipate yet cannot fully stop. Systems designed to protect can fail. Support networks have limits. Even trusted authorities may intervene too late. Legal and social structures offer guidance, but they cannot eliminate human unpredictability. Her professional expertise now carried new depth. Theory met lived experience. Patterns were no longer abstract. They became concrete. Behavior, warning, escalation, all visible in hindsight. She shared insights carefully. With colleagues, friends, and those at risk. Experience added credibility. It also added weight. Responsibility now included prevention and awareness for others. Reflection was continuous. She reanalyzed each action. Each decision she made. Each signal she recognized. Every small choice had contributed to outcomes, positive or negative. And yet, the unsettling question remains. If preparation, awareness, documentation, and support are all in place, what more can truly protect someone when obsession refuses boundaries? The case leaves questions that linger. Patterns, warnings, and choices remain lessons for everyone who studies them. What could have been done differently? What can be learned from this story? If you followed every step of this case carefully, you now understand how persistence, obsession, and human behavior collide. How preparation can delay danger, but not always prevent it. How vigilance is vital, but not always sufficient. For more stories that explore the patterns behind true crime, the escalation, and the psychology of behavior, make sure to stay connected. Subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss a deep dive into the cases that test human awareness and response. If you found value in understanding this case, leave a like. It helps support the research and production of these stories. Share your thoughts in the comments. What patterns did you notice? Which lessons stood out the most? Every case tells more than one story. And your perspective can be part of the discussion. So, subscribe, like, and stay with us for the next story that uncovers the hidden patterns behind human behavior and crime.